Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. And as far as my show is concerned, this may be the biggest. I was just looking at some analytics. Over time, the shows on Jodi Huisentruit, the missing TV anchor from Mason City, Iowa, those shows on Podcast by George have gotten the most views and listens of any shows that I've done. And we're going to be talking about today, National Missing Persons Day. And of course, and that's what Jodi was. Technically, she might still be, but of course, she's been declared dead now because of how long she has been missing. But before we get into that, I wanted to bring up a couple of things here because I cannot do these shows without mentioning stuff in the news. This is something that is clearing the transom just this morning. The U.S. is launching strikes in Iraq and Syria as Israel-Hamas war rages. My God, people, what are we doing? I look at these things. You talk about a head shake. You talk about a head snap. And Joe Biden and these warmongers that he surrounded himself with. And by God, I used to be a Democrat. I mean, you might still call me an old school Democrat, maybe. I don't know. But this ain't the Democratic Party that I've always thought. Maybe I was just being naive. But Biden's the warmonger that everybody said that he was going to be. You know, I look at these headlines and I look at what we're doing around the world, what we're doing in the Middle East right now. I got kind of a goofy way of looking at things. And I talk on the show about the influence of Hollywood and television. Well, it influenced me as well, but in a different way. I'm a child of the 60s and 70s. I was at the impressionable age when Star Trek was on the air. Yeah, the original Star Trek series created by Gene Roddenberry. Well, you know, I used to look at that and kind of the idea behind that with their primary directive or whatever it was and the other things. And I didn't turn out that way on the show a lot, but they were supposed to be the smart guys. They were supposed to be the non-interventionists. They were supposed to be the party that would try to mitigate and mediate and try to resolve things without tearing shit up, blowing things up. And I used to think that's who we were. That's what the United States was. And we're anything but that. We are the biggest bloodlusting, warmongering society in modern history. Look at what we're doing. My God, we are on the precipice of World War III with nuclear weapons bristling everywhere that can take us out in 20 minutes in the 2020 world that we live in. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about National Missing Persons Day and Jodi Huisentruit. Did you see the promo here? Was Jodi Huisentruit killed because of, simple, plain old biblical, murderous, raging jealousy? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to have on the live line our guest, our old buddy, our old pal, Scott Fuller. He spent more than 15 years as head of programming for terrestrial radio stations, Maine, Wyoming, and Minnesota throughout the Midland. In recent years, he's conducted in-depth investigations of high-profile cold cases in several states through various ongoing podcast projects, including the 1995 disappearance, June 27th. Get that right, George. June 27th, 1995. Of Mason City TV anchor Jodi Huisentruit, only 27 years old at the time. And Scott joined findjodi.com in the year 2020. Okay, so let's take that off the screen here. I want to go ahead and click a couple of buttons here. See, I've got to run my own show as well as, let me take that off. Yeah, no, click a button here and bring him on and say good morning to our pal here, Scott Fuller. Hi, Scott.
Good morning, George. Thank you for having me on as always.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, and especially you're under the weather a little bit, so I get that, and particularly for a radio guy.
Coming off of COVID, which I have to disclose because there's no way I'm going to get through this without coughing obnoxiously. Second time around for me, it wasn't as bad for me this time around as the first. I had it summer 2020, I think, as well, but it's still not fun. So I'm sorry.
Well, it's particularly onerous for a guy like you who makes his living with his voice. I mean, we're talking about on air. We're talking about a radio guy. So, yeah, we can't do it with pictures. We got to do it with our voice. And so that's impacted Scott, and wanted to mention that right off the top. Well, here's the other thing that I wanted to mention. And let me bring this up on the stage. this was kind of surprising to me on National Missing Persons Day, these statistics. And some of the statistics are kind of hard to pin down exactly, but here's what it says. It's estimated that around 630,000 people are reported missing each year. Most are eventually located. We just had an Amber Alert here in Iowa, like, when kids go missing,
Mhm.
for example. Most are located. This child was. It's an interesting story, but we're talking about 90,000 a year that are never found. Jodi Huisentruit's among these people. That's almost 1 million people in just the last decade. Where are these missing people? I don't know, Scott. What do you think when you see stats like that?
Yes, it's hard to wrap your mind around those numbers. And you see the discrepancy between the people who were reported missing and most are found soon after, may have
Yeah.
run away or may have miscommunicated even just with where they were supposed to be. But there are those way too many, as you see, that are never found. And Jodi is still, I consider her a missing person. It's a homicide case. I think it's safe to say, legally and criminally. But she's never been found, which is a problem in finding answers in her case as well. But those stats, every time I see stats like that, the numbers are so large, it's hard to wrap your mind around.
I want to encourage everybody now as we go through this show. If you've got a theory, if you've got an idea, particularly if you've got a tip, if you've got a clue, share it with us and find it with Scott because he's the findjodi.com guy. There's no, anything short of alien abduction. If you've got an idea here, let's hear it. Let's get it out there because that's kind of where we're at with this case.
Sure.
She is a missing person. She was actually declared dead, Scott. Now, why was that? Why does that happen? Why would somebody like Jodi be declared dead? Is that an insurance thing? Is that a criminal legal thing? How does that happen?
Yeah, it's both. On the one hand, it's easier for the family when it comes to taking care of just the paperwork, for one of a better phrase, of a missing person presumed dead, of going through everything that is involved, legally speaking. It's also something you have to prove in court if the case were ever to be found in a courtroom or any case of this type. It's one of the legal thresholds, the first legal threshold that a prosecutor would have to prove manslaughter or homicide is that, as the old saying goes, this person isn't going to walk in the middle of the court proceeding. So they have to prove first and foremost that the person is dead.
And there's that beautiful picture of Jodi. And does her beauty play a role in all of this? 27 years old. And did that have something to do with her disappearance? That's all, subject to be determined, conjecture. I don't know what you want to call it. But the number of NCIC missing person files in the United States from 1990 to 2022. Here's the number. Here's the stats. This is from Statista. And people watching in video might be able to see this on the screen. It's big enough, but this is basically running from 1990 right through 2022. And the red line that I've drawn in here with the explanation point is the year that Jodi went missing. And look at these huge numbers in and around 1995. And look at how they've kind of steadily declined. Now, there is a little blip towards the end here where they were trending back up in 2022. I don't know if that had anything to do with the COVID era or not. But Scott, what's your take on this? You got any idea why there would be such a high number of missing people in the 90s at the time that Jodi went missing?
Well, I think it's a combination of a lot of factors, and I'm not sure I can point to all of them. Reporting would probably have something to do with it. Technology, I think, would have something to do with it, just the society that we live in now versus the 90s, interconnectivity. I'm sure law enforcement practice has something to do with it. When people were reported missing in the 90s versus today, they were treated procedurally a little bit differently. But it's hard to ignore on that graph the stark difference between 95, when Jodi disappeared, and today. You can see from those stats that the missing persons case number in America is as low as it's been in the last 3 decades, apparently, but still way too high. But it's one more aspect of the case, George, that we don't probably think about enough, is Jodi went missing at the peak of missing persons cases in the U.S.
Yeah. And look at those huge numbers on both those slides that I showed. But I kind of wanted to go to this because I want people to understand that cold cases do get solved. And this was one of the most recent. Now, I didn't make a lot of news in a lot of parts of the country, but this was out of the Denver Post. Westminster Police Department solves a 48-year-old cold case murder of a 20-year-old woman. And again, this strikes home for Jodi because her case is old. Some people consider it to be a cold case. Some people say, yeah, it's not cold, but 48 years ago, the department used genetic genealogy to identify the late Thomas Elliott as the murderer of Therese Becker. I'll read this a little bit and then we'll get Scott's take on it. Westminster police have solved the nearly 5-decade-old cold case murder of a 20-year-old woman using genetic genealogy to identify the killer. Thomas Elliott, who routinely spent time in and out of the prison system for various crimes before taking his own life in 1991, was identified as the murderer of 20-year-old Therese Becker, who had moved to the Denver area from Casper, Wyoming, shortly after graduating high school, according to a release from the Westminster Police Department and a Westminster cold case report. The identification comes 48 years after Becker was found dead in a field near 100th Avenue and Lowell Boulevard on December 6, 1975, 2 days after she attempted to hitchhike to visit her boyfriend in Adams County Jail in Brighton, according to the release. Her autopsy revealed that she'd been raped and died of asphyxiation. The identification concludes decades of investigation from multiple police departments. In 2003, a breakthrough occurred when the Colorado Bureau of Investigation extracted a piece of male DNA from evidence related to the rape, the release says. Now, it's a cold case. There's a huge time frame here. Those are a couple of similarities with Jodi cases. Of course, this is dissimilar in a lot of ways. Most notably, they had a body right away. They had that forensic evidence. They had DNA. And let me ask you about that, Scott, because we've talked about it. Is there the possibility that there could still be some DNA evidence available to investigators in Jodi Huisentruit's case that's under lock and key somewhere?
I hope so, but I don't think so, personally. Investigators from 95 all the way up to today at various agencies have never given any indication, certainly directly, that there's DNA in Jodi's case, and that's really unfortunate because of the story you just highlighted, George. I live in Wyoming now. We were talking about that story in the newsroom this week because her father lived in Casper, was a car dealer there. And when I see that number, 48 years, it's just It's amazing. And you see 50-plus-year-old cases that are closed. But every one of those cases, 201 has DNA that can be definitively linked, because all other avenues that are typically used to solve investigations are pretty closed at that point, in terms of there's no fingerprint evidence, at least that's useful enough to prosecute. Witness testimony after 5 decades is very difficult for a jury, I think, to rely on, and juries like DNA in the modern era. So that kind of physical evidence is very important to solve any cold case in this day and age. But we're hopeful that there is some other breakthrough in Jodi's case, and we are hopeful that whether it's DNA or anything else, that there is some kind of guilty knowledge evidence or some kind of linkable evidence that either we don't know about or has been previously overlooked in Jodi's case, that they can use to start toward an answer in finding the person who did this to her.
Well, let me go ahead and bring this up on stage here and give people a look at this, because there is some evidence. There were some things left behind by this cold-blooded killer. We've touched on it a little bit for people that are joining around the country and may not be that familiar with this case, Scott. And I know you've told the story many times, but give us the fundamentals here on what happened June 27th, 1995, in that Mason City apartment parking lot.
Yeah, Jodi, as you said, George, went missing on that Tuesday morning. Jodi was a news anchor at KIMT, Channel 3 in Mason City, Iowa. She'd been there about 18 months. She anchored the Daybreak show, very early morning broadcast. She was typically at work at 3:30 in the morning, 3:30. And on that morning, Tuesday, following a long day of a Chamber of Commerce golf outing in Mason City and a night of socializing afterwards. She failed to report to work by about 4 o'clock in the morning. Her producer called her and asked where she was. Because of that phone call, we know that Jodi was in her apartment at about 3:50-ish on that Tuesday morning. Amy Kuntz, Jodi's producer, said she spoke with Jodi, sounded groggy, maybe like she'd overslept. In fact, Jodi said she'd overslept and that she'd be into the station very shortly. She never arrived at the TV station, and eventually, after Jodi failed to appear, one of the staff members at KINT called the Mason City Police for a welfare check at 7:13 in the morning. First officer responds to the scene and finds some of what you just showed on the screen there, George, of a woman's belongings next to Jodi's red Mazda Miata convertible. And that was basically the start and finish of the case. And in terms of direct physical evidence that we're aware of, it does start and end in the Key apartment parking lot, just 12 steps from Jodi's egress point of her upstairs apartment at the Key apartment complex. There's never been any evidence of Jodi that we know of that's been found anywhere outside of that parking lot. There are, of course, leads and tips that come into police and to us over the years in the thousands, I'm sure at this point, from the original investigation on. But there is no, she's missing a few items from that scene that we know of. Those have never been found. Obviously, Jodi's remains have never been found. So that's probably what makes this case most difficult, is all the evidence that was collected there is all the physical evidence that we know of in Jodi's case that the authorities have.
Mary Knox is watching today. She's great. She's very insightful. She's got a perspective here, Iowa-based. There's a missing Iowa woman, Tammy Zawicki, was murdered in that same time period. That's still unsolved. And the bigger point there is the solving of Jodi's case may come from the solving of another case. I mean, that happens sometimes. Yeah, one leads to the other. It may be an indirect, maybe a Tammy Zawicki type case will get solved, and that will lead folks to the murderer of this case. Now, here's a comment from Bo Blatchett. It says, check out Iowa Cold Cases site under Jodi's name in the comment section. Start your research from that point. Okay. Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, there's a number of places you can go to get information on these cases. Here's something, again, we talk about this Mazda Miata. And here it is. This is on findjodi.com. This is on the hook. I think being taken from the parking lot. Is that correct, Scott? And then talk about the significance of this key.
The car key that you see there was to Jodi's Miata. Jodi had owned the Miata for only a few weeks at that point. She purchased it through an off-the-books sort of deal with a local car dealer employee who did work at a car dealership but was doing both the seller and Jodi a favor, and also, frankly, increasing his commission a little bit in doing it outside of his dealership hours. Brokered the sale, but there's been some confusion over the years because Jodi had not transferred the title to her name at the time that she was abducted. So the car has become a sticking point in a lot of ways, and it should be. It's the object that Jodi was standing next to, we think, when Jodi was abducted. The key that you showed there on the screen there, George, hard to see in that picture, but it's slightly bent. We've talked about this before, but you know how sturdy a car key is. So it's presumed that Jodi had that key in the driver's side door lock as she was attacked from behind, and the force of the abduction not only bent the car key, the attack from behind not only bent the car key, but also the driver's side mirror forward in the direction it's not supposed to go as well. We did extensive research on the car. Find Jodi is a great website to go to for all information in the case, but especially on the car. I went and found the current owner of Jodi's car. He still owns it. That car is in phenomenal shape. It's kind of a hobby car for him. Didn't know initially until we contacted him. I don't believe that it was Jodi Huisentruit's car, and I was able to sit in that car with him, which was a surreal experience for me. Evidentiarily, probably, obviously now, no significance. There's not going to be any DNA on the outside of Jodi's car 28 years later. But just to see that is one of the many things in years of researching this case that really brought it home to me that this is obviously this is a real person. This is a real thing that happened, and was one of her prized possessions. One of many things that she had planned for the rest of her life that was taken away from her on that morning.
Yeah. She was very proud of the car. Never really got to enjoy it very much. It is one of the tragedies.
Now, as you know, George, that's a very impractical car for Iowa, a Mazda convertible. But and that's a point too. Is every indication Jodi was not going to stay in Mason City. You know, the media industry. It's a 2-year TV contract. Jodi was at about 18 months, and regardless of that, I think she was looking for bigger markets and warmer weather anyway. And I don't know for sure, but I think the purchase of that car was sort of a not only a gift to herself, but also something that she was not going to be driving around in Iowa. She might be driving that to a different TV station in a much warmer state here, had she lived.
Yeah, and you've been working on this case for a long time. I've been following it. I remember it well. I was out of the broadcasting business at that time, but it really struck home with me because of the early morning hours and the abduction going in that early. And I know you've done that too, working in radio. I used to tell people back in the day when I was going into work at 4 o'clock in the morning, I told people there's only really 3 categories of people on the streets other than me, newspaper boys, and think about Johnny Gosh and Eugene Martin being abducted here in the greater Des Moines area, cops, and not many of them, and criminals. I mean, I used to think about that back in the day. And so here she was trying to get into work at, 5 o'clock in the morning or something like that. Was it about 5, Scott, or 4?
I think it was about 4:15.
4:15, yeah. And
but she never even got that far. And an important point in Jodi's case, I think, to understand is she's not at the gas station. She's not in a public place. It's her apartment parking lot very early in the morning, and it's a very confined space. And she parked very close to the door that would lead to the building of her complex into her upstairs apartment. So even if the wrong type of person were walking down Kentucky Avenue and saw Jodi and decided, spur of the moment, I'm going to do something terrible in this instant, and made the immediate decision, Jodi would have had time and the vantage point to see that person coming toward her from Kentucky Avenue. So she had to have been, I think, attacked from probably behind, and that person had to be there waiting for her. I think the one of few certainties that we have in Jodi's case is whatever their relationship to her was, if there was any relationship between Jodi and her attacker at all, that person was ready for her and waiting. Probably for some time that morning. You can see from a lot of vantage points in the parking lot and the street, her apartment light turn on as Amy calls that morning, turn off as Jodi prepares to leave, and then perhaps stage themselves in position to be able to wait for her to walk out that door. Obviously, at that moment, the very last thing in the world that Jodi is worried about is somebody attacking her as she's running late for work and just doing what we all do every day, and just getting in your car.
Yeah, and murder is maybe the most insane of all acts, and insanity is not logical. But I've kind of been looking at some things here that, I don't know, seem to be logical to me. That doesn't mean that they're true or not, but I wanted to get to them and pulled a couple of things off of the findjodi.com site. To talk about. This plays a role in kind of the theory that I'm working with right now. The Mason City Police Department chief at the time and several other officers soon after arrived at the key apartment complex after the incident. Lieutenant Frank Stearns said the toilet seat was up in Jodi's apartment, raising some questions if Jodi had a male visitor. In a statement to a Globe Gazette newspaper reporter the day after Jodi was abducted, the Mason City Police Department chief, Jack Schlieper, said police also found no evidence that anyone was with her prior to her disappearance. I wanted to ask you about this, Scott, because this is interesting, and it kind of goes to the heart of evidentiary material, police work, criminal lawsuits, and that type of thing. Right here, it says there's no evidence, yet the toilet seat was up. I've heard there were a couple of beer cans found in Jodi's apartment. I don't think she was much of a beer drinker, if at all, and a couple of wine glasses that could have been for two people to be drinking wine. You look at that and you say, well, that's evidence that there was a man there. Yet this police chief says there is no evidence. And by the strictest definition of evidence, these things that I'm talking about really aren't evidence. Is that correct? Is that the way to look at this?
Well, first of all, I'd say that Jodi did drink beer. I wouldn't say excessively to the point where it was a problem for her. There's no evidence of that, but she was a social drinker occasionally, absolutely. So the beer cans themselves should be factored in. I don't know how far we can take that because we don't know who they belong to. I've seen the beer cans be fit into people's theories if they think it works. I don't think you can read anything much into it. They may have been Jodi's. There may have been a guest from the night before, possibly. There may have been a guest from 2-3 nights before. Don't know. In terms of the cans, in terms of the toilet seat, Lieutenant Stearns said that for the first time, I believe, several years after the incident, as the case was turning cold, and that was a big revelation. I don't think you should overlook the toilet seat, but I don't think you necessarily have to come to the conclusion that, yes, there was a man in her apartment on that morning. It is one possibility. Another possibility is that Jodi may have been ill the night before or sometime that morning. A possibility that people may have a hard time hearing this, but it's certainly possible that police responding to the scene may have used the facilities there as well at some point. Doesn't say when in the process of processing the inside of the apartment the seat was found up, so we don't know. All those are possible. I wouldn't weigh one any more heavily than the other, except when it comes to a male visitor. There is no other indication from anybody or anywhere that there was anybody in Jodi Huisentruit's apartment that night. And if you do kind of expand your thinking to there's a person inside who's involved, then I wonder why the attack happened in the parking lot and after she left, and it opens up a whole sort of other thought experiment that you can do with the scene. So yeah, it's something that police have said. It's a detail from the case file that should be considered, but there are a lot of possibilities. And one thing I've always said about Jodi's case, just generally, is while I'm sure there were mistakes made in the course of the Jodi Huisentruit investigation over many administrations and all this long period of time, it's tough to do everything right. But I think sometimes in these really long unsolved cold cases, especially still missing person cases, people don't give police enough credit in that maybe the reason this isn't solved is because it's not as straightforward as your typical case. Occam's razor applies a lot of the time, but not in necessarily homicide investigations all the time. Crazy things happen, illogical things happen. People behave in ways that aren't the way that we're thinking necessarily. So I don't know what that would be in Jodi's case, but I do think if a case is 1 or 2 years old, as I look into them, you look at it one way, because that's early days yet when it comes to a homicide investigation. But when you're talking about 2 or 3 decades, I think you have to look at it through a little bit of a different lens. And one of those is to sometimes give law enforcement credit that they did a good part of their job the right way. And there is something that is just weird and off about certain cases.
And to foreshadow where I'm headed with this thing. Now, I don't think the person in the apartment did it. I think somebody that thought they had a claim to Jodi, who may or may not even have been known to her, was aware of a male friend in the apartment, a tryst that had developed. We're going to get to this angle here very shortly, and staked out the apartment house, waited for the guest to leave, and then confronted Jodi, and then who knows what happened from that point forward. Let me bring this next slide up, because there's a couple of things here I wanted to get to Scott on. In a 2004 interview with FindJodi.com's Josh Benson and Gary Peterson, Lieutenant Ron Vanderweerd said, unfortunately, in this case, there's not a lot of evidence, period, but we do have definite parts of the investigation, different things that we know that we are withholding for just that reason. That if we are able to develop a subject, that we are able to eliminate him or corroborate with him. When Josh asked if police would consider releasing more evidence at some point to help solve the investigation, Lieutenant Vanderweerd said, right now, there are no plans to release it. Obviously, we would release it if we felt it could help something. But right now, we're afraid it would just hurt. We don't have that much to go on, and we don't want to give up on what we do have. The interview was conducted 1 year after Josh and Gary co-founded the nonprofit FindJodi.com organization in 2003. Okay, let's talk about this, Scott, because the methodology that they're using, withholding this information, safeguarding it very carefully in hopes of it not jeopardizing their capturing the person responsible for this, it ain't working. And I got to tell you something, at my very essence, I'm kind of an impulsive person. I'm kind of, maybe it's why I'm a left winger in politics. And I'm somebody that I don't like sticking with something that's a loser, a status quo circumstance. Do you think as time goes on that they will start to change direction, or is there anything really to be released that they haven't released, or do you have any sense for this angle at all?
I can't speak with authority to obviously what the police are thinking inside their investigation. That interview with our co-founder Josh Benson and Gary Peterson, that's 20 years ago that Lieutenant Vanderweerd is saying, we're going to withhold guilty knowledge evidence. We're going to withhold evidence that we may be able to use in a prosecution. That I think is not only fine, but that's the way you have to go about a case, especially with minimal evidence. I think there is something to be said about now 20 years later, where we're looking at 25 plus 28 years of Jodi being missing, where it would not hurt to get creative in your thinking inside law enforcement in ways that still preserve the integrity of the case file. There are many ways that's been done in cases over the years. Another aspect of this case may be that there is not any further substantial evidence to release that would garner the kind of information that police are looking for. That's sort of the most pessimistic way to look at it. Police aren't going to comment on this either way, and most of me agrees that they shouldn't. I mean, I do have a sympathy for law enforcement generally when it comes to these investigations, because they are not there to stand up and say, no, this is why we did this. This is why we didn't do this. Having said that, mistakes are made in these cases as well, excluding Jodi's many of these unsolved cases. So go ahead.
No, I was going to say, it reminds me of that article that we started off with the situation out of the Denver Post there about this person of the guilty party being found posthumously after they had died. Might that play a role in this as well? Let's say police have a suspect. Maybe they have a primary suspect, but again, this is conjecture on my part. Don't you want to let it all out? I mean, don't you want to go to the wall before that person dies so that they can be held accountable for this, or is that not a realistic factor?
Sure. I'm sure they would. The one thing I'm most certain of when it comes to my interactions with current investigators on this case, especially within the Mason City Police Department, is they want this case solved. There is no lack of desire on the current administration's part to have this case solved. You have to operate within legal and law enforcement confines when you go about advancing these cases, and those are limited for very good reasons. Taking away a person's personal liberties is one of the founding tenets of our country in terms of the inverse is true. That's very difficult to do. The burden of proof is very high for the state to do that, which is the way it should be, but it also makes it very difficult to prosecute these cases as evidence is scarce and so much time goes on. So I'm not going to the only law enforcement critique that I'm not sure that honestly anybody currently on the investigation would disagree with is that there were probably mistakes made in the initial days of the investigation when it comes to decisions that were made and leads that were followed, and to the processing of the scene itself, because you got one shot at that. And 95 DNA is a law enforcement known quantity in 1995. It wasn't very known in the public eye. Right around the time of O.J. Simpson is the most time probably the majority of Americans had learned of DNA. But law enforcement had been prosecuting cases using DNA for at least 7, 8, if not longer years prior to that. And when you see pictures of the techs and officers processing the parking lot of Jodi's apartment, not wearing gloves And there are inexplicable to me diet soda cans all over the place, and evidence is just being stuffed in crates. And that's subjective from news photos that we have at the time, but it does not lend credibility to the future advancement of technology. It really handcuffs now what current investigators are going to be able to do.
Well, small town, middle America. I mean, that's what Mason City is.
Yeah.
We're talking about the 1990s. Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown. I mean, maybe things have improved since then. My God, let's hope so. Let's get this up and get this going here, because this is what's leading me to my current thinking. Now, this is some reporting that came out of the New York Post, and it's the New York Post reporting of what was in the Sun. So the U.S. Sun tabloid publication. So you've got a couple of tabloids here. And normally there was a time when I wouldn't give much credibility to tabloid reporting at all. But now my opinion has changed based on what I've seen come out of the mainstream media over the last 10, 15 years. And I want to get to this. And the hypothesis is Iowa TV news anchor had a secret fling before vanishing in 1995. Now, this is according to an investigator. An Iowa television news anchor had a secret final fling with a mystery man just 10 days before going missing nearly 3 decades ago. Wow, what a blockbuster. Wait a minute. That's according to a private investigator. Oh, a private investigator. Cold case sleuth Steve Ridge has been probing the mysterious disappearance of Jodi Huisentruit, a news anchor for KIMT TV in Mason City, Iowa, who's 27. She vanished in early June of 1995. I gotta get that thing off so I can see. Okay, through my digging, I learned that Jodi had a very secret final fling with a man she met just 10 days before she went missing. Ridge, who has been investigating the case for years, told the U.S. Sun, that's where the original reporting of this came out. Ridge believes jealousy was a factor in Huisentrut's murder, since she had strong admirers that her newfound love interest might infuriate other suitors. Police interviewed neighbors who heard screams. Scott mentioned that. I mean, that's a certainty. I mean, there were reports of that, indicating a struggle had taken place, according to Ridge, who revealed information to the U.S. Sun that was previously only known to law enforcement. Among the fresh details was that Huisentrut's love interest was a 27-year-old man who was from out of state. Okay, and this was all on the wires here several months ago. It's not new news now, but where do you stand on this stuff, Scott?
Well, Jodi had different circles of friends. I've always described them as. She had relationships that other friends of hers didn't know about, friendships. I mean, she also had male relationships over the years. She had, I'm sure, some in Iowa. She never had a steady boyfriend that we're aware of, as is typical in cases where young women go missing. This is not something that we're how do I put this best, George? Most diplomatically. This is not something I can comment on because we haven't independently corroborated this. The things that jump out from what's in the public information is if this fling is, if I read correctly, started 10 days before she met this man, 10 days before June 27th. We do know fairly well Jodi's timeline in those 10 days, and she was pretty busy. She was with friends water skiing a previous weekend. She obviously had to be at work every single morning. She had social engagement. She had radio engagement, television engagements. So if this was a fling, I don't know where Jodi has the time to do it. I'm sure Jodi had relationships with men when she was in Iowa, but I don't see the genesis, I guess. I don't see the link, especially if the New York Post report is that law enforcement is aware of this, and now because of this report, the public is aware of this. If police already know about it, presumably it's been investigated. So I can't speak any further to it because if you go to findjodi.com, you're going to find stuff that we have thoroughly vetted. We do not release every single factoid that we find. These have been thoroughly researched, and these are made public for reasons that we think will at least not hurt the investigation in advance advocacy of her case. So I did see that. Obviously, when it came out, I can't speak to it. If it's been investigated by police and there is no other public information accompanying what Steve Ridge has released, then there's nothing else to investigate.
Well, again, it calls into question the modus operandi of the police department, their methodology, because if this has been discovered, what Ridge is talking about here, and he's revealed it, and it's been published worldwide in these national tabloids, why would the police not say, okay, what the hell, it's out there, here it is, this is what we know, and divulge all of this and see what becomes of it? But that hasn't happened. These reports came out in October, right? Or
police are never going to do that. Any investigation is never going to do that. They're never going to comment one way or the other, up, down, or sideways about public information in a case unless they think that it can somehow advance some kind of plan that they have for pursuing an angle of an investigation or prosecution of a case. This is what I was trying to refer to earlier, in that police will, they have to stay silent most of the time. And I'm sure it's very frustrating for them to see things like that come out. Now, if they thought there was something to it, and if they thought, if we comment in this way, or if we add additional information to this, then it might lead to something, I'm sure they would. I'm sure they would come out with some additional information. But what was in the New York Post in that clip was very scant in terms of details. And when we get tips, George, if we got, for example, a submission, this is an example, hypothetical, if we got something from a person who said, I had a secret fling with Jodi starting 10 days before she went missing, the process that we would have to go through in order to even consider publishing it is, as a journalist, it's very, very extensive. And beyond that, there's a more important consideration of, even if we get it publishable, should we? Is this going to help the case in any way whatsoever? And only then, when it's verifiable and when it's something that is not going to hurt the investigation or the chance of finding answers in Jodi's case, only then will we come forward with. Could be that, could be anything. There are hundreds of such examples just in my relatively short time with Find Jodi over the last several years that I could give to that. So people are going to do what they do. That's not how we operate. That's not something we're comfortable doing in something as important as a 28-year-old unsolved case.
Yeah, and you've got to be diplomatic, and I certainly understand that, and you have been. Because if you look at the article here, the attribution, where all of this is coming from, it's coming from one source, Steve Ridge. I mean, he's the only one that is, so you got to look at this, and it's what he thinks, it's what he feels, it's what he believes. And there's about 3 ways to look at this, Scott, and I know you've encountered this before. It could be self-promotion on a private investigator's part. It could be that stirring the pot a little bit, maybe taking some stuff that's known and some conjecture and throwing it together and keeping it out there. It's done with good intent because they want to get this, as an example, in the New York Post and the U.S. Sun. And all exposure is almost good exposure when it comes to a case like this. And then lastly, maybe he's got something. Maybe the guy has found something. I mean, that's the other part of this. Let me read what else is in this reporting here from the New York Post. Ridge said he met the man, this mystery man, this 27-year-old guy, 28, who gave him a tour of the Mason City home where he stayed during their relationship. And he's talking about this guy with Jodi. That home is the last place Jodi went on a date before she went missing, Ridge told the U.S. Sun. I don't know if that's true or not, but 5 days before her disappearance, Huisentruit and her beau sat on the back deck having drinks overlooking the lake. The man told Ridge that he and Huisentruit had an immediate attraction and a bond. Okay, so and this highlighting here is mine. It goes to this timeline that Scott was talking about. 5 days before her disappearance, Huisentruit and her beau sat on the back deck having drinks overlooking the lake. And Ridge released a photo that he says he took from this guy's house and overlooking the lake and the patio where they sad. And rather than try to pin Scott down on that, I'm just going to keep going with this. The private investigator said they both knew their blossoming relationship might infuriate other suitors. Ridge added that he has no doubt that jealousy played a role in Jodi's demise. I am certain that his quickly blossoming relationship with Jodi played a central role in her abduction days later, Ridge said. Ridge is certain. I believe without a doubt that his relationship was clearly a factor in what happened, because this was not a random act of violence. It wasn't anything like that. It wasn't a stalker that came out of nowhere. And the reason I highlighted that, now going back to this kind of little theory that I have going about somebody that for whatever reason thought that they, just couldn't take the fact that she might have a male suitor who might be in that apartment with her. That would be a stalker. That person may very well not have been known to Jodi. That person may very well have come out of nowhere. So you've got a, conflation here. You've got some contradiction about the possibilities. And that's where this is going. The Post has sought comment from the Mason City Department. Now, again, this is key also. Ridge doubled the reward that he's ponied up for information that will help locate Huisentruit's remains. $50,000. Money can be a very powerful incentive to motivate someone who is otherwise reluctant to come forward, Ridge said, according to the Des Moines, Iowa outlet KCCI. Time is not on our side, and we need to heat up this cold case. Remember what I said about wanting to stir it around a little bit and get people involved, and Ridge appears to have his heart in the right place. It might be a little bit too much on his sleeve, but he's trying to get somebody to move and to talk on this thing. But the downside, if there is any downside to rewards for information, Scott, and you know this all too well, is you start to get people that like money a lot, but they don't really have much information, and they come forward because of the money.
Yeah, and that's why typically this is done more formally through Crime Stoppers, or it's a suggested thing by the agencies themselves, and it's usually much earlier in an investigation when that's more likely to be relevant. But if I've in full disclosure, I've talked to Steve, I think twice over the past several years, and probably years ago at this point, and it's his $50,000. That is not the way I would approach. Obviously, because I'm doing things differently to find Jodi, but that's not the way I would approach Jodi going missing. Let me give you an example, George, of not necessarily to say anything about anybody else, but it's probably years ago now. But this is not a tip that came in. This was a piece of public information. This was open source information. One of the things I'll do in researching Jodi's case is I'll come up with theories or angles, or just look through public records that are available. And I found something that is, it's fair to say, headline worthy as relates to Jodi's case and the investigation. And at that moment, it was I'm not going to tell you what the information was for the same reason I'm about to tell you. But at that moment, it was scoop worthy. If we were just a news organization to find Jodi, or if I were just a private investigator or independent journalist, that would have been a headline attention aspect of Jodi's case. I brought that information to the police. This, again, is not a human source piece of information. This is something I found that's available to anybody. I just happened to be on a train of thought where I found it, and brought it to the police. They were very interested in it. They looked into it thoroughly. They don't have to tell me what they ever found beyond that, and they haven't. But I have that information, and rather than get credit for it, and rather than making it public, it's one more thing that the investigation can use to maybe or maybe not advance to find an answer in Jodi's case. But I'm not going to go running to the New York Post when I have something like that. It's just not. I know these families. I know these invested investigators, not just in Jodi's case, but in, at this point, dozens of other cold cases as well. And that's not why I do this. If there's at any point where we think publicity can help generate information, then we're not ashamed to ask for it. We appreciate the coverage of your show and the other coverage that Jodi gets, because at this point, people talking is one of the ways that Jodi's case might be solved. But
Yeah.
it's frustrating to see, not specifically talking about that information or anything else, but if somebody came to me with that same story and he was the only source of that information, it would certainly be interesting to me. But it's not. We have to somehow verify that, for one thing, and secondly, even if we did, why release it? There would have to be a good reason to release that information that would not only not harm the case, but maybe advance the case.
Yeah, and to clarify here a little bit now, the original reporting with Ridge and the release of the photo that he took and all that came through the U.S. Sun tabloid, and then the New York Post reported on the Sun's reporting, and that's kind of the way journalism works in this country now. But and we gotta let Scott go here very shortly because again he's struggling with COVID and we're about out of time. But Mary Knox had a question on here earlier, a comment or two. Now she rides shotgun on my show. Great minds think alike. Here's she just sent this in. Get this. So she says, Mary Knox, let me get this up. She says, maybe you ought to look at the lake in question. The water is low now. Yeah, well, water is everywhere. And so let me bring this up on screen. I had this slide prepared. I wanted to show it to Scott and get his feelings on it. This is, and we talk about Mason City. And we just talked about Clear Lake because of that article. We don't think about the direct proximity, people that aren't familiar with the area, and I know that Scott is, between Mason City and Clear Lake. You can see that I drew a line here on the major road from Mason City proper, and approximately where Jodi's apartment was where this yellow line starts, if people are watching in video. Straight to the lake. It's 17 minutes. And I've got to believe, because they always do this, but that the lake or its shoreline, a lot of it anyway, has been dragged, that they have searched that lake somewhat for Jodi's body. Am I correct in that, Scott?
They've searched everywhere practically on that map between the Key Apartments and the lake at some point, and well beyond that in every direction with the initial ground search. Clear Lake was a place that Jodi would socialize in. It's the place where she would have her hair cut. She would water ski on that lake. So yeah, if there were incredible information that leading police to believe that she's in the lake, I'm sure they would. If they haven't, I'm sure they would search the lake. That is one aspect, though, of Jodi's case, George. Sorry, COVID brain fog.
Yeah.
One aspect is that in all of these years of planting and harvesting and summer recreation and hunting and fishing, Jodi's body has not been found. And we can't say for sure that that's definitive of anything, but I think it's a factor. I think it's worth thinking about. Is she disposed of sort of intentionally and permanently? Hate to put it that way, but is she in a place where she's just not going to be found? Since typically that's the way in rural areas where some remains can be found, is a hunter will stumble across something or something along those lines. But that has not been the case in Jodi's case. So it's one of many aspects to consider, but it's unusual. It's very unusual for a body not to be found after 28 years. Obviously, it does happen, but it's the vast minority of cases.
Yeah, and I've thought about this angle in the case too, and we saw a lot of this recently with the big lakes that were going dry out in California, and the finding of stuff and people at the bottoms of those lakes, and then in the Mojave as an example, and then around Las Vegas in the southwestern U.S., They say it's a great burial ground for the mafia and so on. Well, if you've ever been out in these boonies or these farm fields, these rural areas, and this is one, they're all potential burial grounds. It's as much so as any Mojave Desert is, and that's what we're talking about here. And trying to search any or all of that is going to be an extraordinary effort, and they have done their best, and nothing has turned up yet. Well, I got to let Scott go here. We're coming up on the top of the hour. Scott, I want you to close it out here and just give us your final thoughts. Maybe promote the website. Tell people anything else that you want to. And I'm going to show some photos here of Jodi while you close it out. Yeah, go ahead.
No, thank you, George. Findjodi.com is a great, it's the place, in my opinion, to find information about Jodi's case. It's a remarkable thing, founded so long ago by Josh Benson and Gary Peterson as a passion project as they work together in Jodi's same media market. And it's I can't think of another site like it for any case like this that has been dedicated to one specific case and has been generating information and advocating for Jodi's case for so long. I've often said I wish every case like Jodi's had a findjodi.com. So it's a great place to start. It's the first place I ever heard about the Jodi Huisentruit investigation. A coworker of mine said you should check out this website. I've never heard of Jodi. Went there, and that's the first place I learned about it. We work very hard to make sure that the most accurate information and the most relevant information is available on that site. So any questions that you have, that's a great place. Findjodi.com to go look and start if you want to look into it, just as I did. To anybody who has connections in the Mason City, Iowa area, I always say, assume for the moment there is no DNA in Jodi's case. If that is the case, then this would have to be solved if it is answered in very few other ways, George. It would have to be people talking, and it would have to be relationships changing, or the discovery of some kind of object in some attic or something, or a family story that's been told over the years, an ex-husband, an uncle who passed away. I don't know what it would be, but to get that name or that possible connection in front of the authorities, I always encourage people to contact the Iowa Department of Criminal Investigations, the state investigative agency. The Mason City Police Department obviously has jurisdiction in this case. Findjodi.com if you want to submit something anonymously. I regularly say, just make sure that somebody knows what it is that you think you know about Jodi's case. Don't worry about wasting anybody's time. Yeah. This is why we volunteer our time to do that. So please reach out to us, reach out to the authorities, even if you've done so before. The investigators have changed in these agencies over the years. They're obviously different than they were 28 years ago. So reach out and make sure that this new investigator knows exactly what you think you know. That's the only way, pending DNA or something else I'm not thinking of right now. That's the only way that we're going to be able to find an answer in Jodi's cases. I know for sure somebody knows something, as the saying goes, as it says on our billboard in Mason City. Don't sit in silence anymore. The time to talk is now. There are people that know, and I don't know what their relationships are. I don't know how they know, but I don't know how you can carry that information with you on your soul for all these years, but people are capable of doing that and worse. So please, if you encounter something like that, if you think you know something, or if you've never said what you know, or if you do know something, say it again if you've said it before. That's all we can do at this point, George, is be a lighthouse for Jodi's case and encourage people to come forward and give the people who can do something about this the information that you have.
God, that's a great close. I was even going to say, I'm not a theologian, folks, but I've been saying this all along. If you're responsible, or if you know something that you've been sitting on all these years, you want to give it up. Again, I'm not a religion. I'm not a seminary student, but you don't want to go to your grave with that information, because that may not portend well for you. Give it up, and get this case solved. And Scott, the next time I talk to you, I hope that you're over COVID, and I hope that the Jodi Huisentruit case has been solved.
I would love nothing more for Jodi's sister, her family, and it would mean a lot to a lot of people who to this day remember where they were in North Iowa when they heard that Jodi went missing. Also, George, just for the rest of us societally, this should not be allowed to happen. This is not something that should be allowed to happen. And if you do something like this, you should be aware that forever people are going to be looking for you. So please, if anybody knows anything, come forward, and don't worry about wasting our time or the police's time. Frankly, just reach out to somebody, let somebody know what you know about Jodi's case.
And so that means we're going to talk at least one more time. Scott Fuller, findjodi.com. Thanks again for coming on this Podcast by George live line.
Thanks, George.
And folks, if you like seeing Scott Fuller, if you like having an opportunity to pose questions to somebody that knows what he's talking about here, subscribe to podcastbygeorge.com. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube right now, just, click the thumbs up and subscribe on YouTube, ring that notification bell, and you're in for the video. And if you just want to hear the audio versions of this, like the radio world that Scott works in, you don't want to look at me. I get that. I understand that completely. Well, then go to podcastbygeorge.com and click on one of the audio only platforms, and you'll get the podcast in its entirety there. But folks, that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.